The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand corridors of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla walked slowly toward the king's private study. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a letter that had arrived just hours earlier. The ornate doors seemed heavier than usual as she pushed them open, finding Charles seated behind his mahogany desk, reviewing state papers with his usual methodical precision. "Charles, we need to talk," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. The king looked up, immediately sensing the distress in his wife's tone. The letter in her hand bore the official seal of the royal household, and Charles knew without reading it what news it contained. For months, tensions had been building within the royal family regarding Camilla's relatives and their increasing presence at royal functions. Her son Tom Parker Bowles and daughter Laura Lopes had been fixtures at various ceremonies, and her extended family had grown comfortable in their proximity to the throne. However, recent events had changed everything. The previous week, Camilla's nephew had been photographed at a nightclub, allegedly making inappropriate comments about the royal family to strangers. The incident, though minor in the grand scheme of royal scandals, had been the final straw for advisors who had long worried about the Parker Bowles family's influence on the monarchy's reputation. Charles had spent sleepless nights weighing his options. His love for Camilla was unwavering, but his duty as king demanded difficult decisions. The Prime Minister had expressed concerns, and senior courtiers had presented him with a comprehensive report outlining potential risks to the crown's stability if immediate action wasn't taken. "I've made my decision," Charles said quietly, not looking up from his papers. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Camilla sank into the leather chair across from his desk, her eyes already beginning to well with tears. The king explained that effective immediately, Camilla's family members would be restricted from attending official royal functions. Their access to royal residences would be limited, and any future interactions would require prior approval from the palace security team. The decision wasn't about punishment, Charles emphasized, but about protecting the institution of the monarchy. Camilla listened in stunned silence as her husband outlined the new restrictions. Her children, who had become accustomed to their roles as extended members of the royal family, would now find themselves on the outside looking in. The grandchildren she had hoped would grow up knowing their step-grandfather as king would now see him only under carefully controlled circumstances. "You're asking me to choose between my family and the crown," Camilla finally managed to say, her voice cracking with emotion. Charles reached across the desk, but she pulled her hand away. The gesture, small as it was, created a chasm that seemed to fill the entire room. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Charles explaining the political pressures and constitutional concerns that had forced his hand. Palace advisors had warned that any perceived favoritism toward the Parker Bowles family could undermine public support for the monarchy at a time when Republican sentiment was already growing in several Commonwealth nations. Camilla understood the reasoning intellectually, but emotionally, she felt betrayed by the man she had supported through his own family troubles. She had stood by him during the difficult years following Diana's death, had weathered public criticism and media scrutiny, only to find that when push came to shove, her family was expendable. As the meeting concluded, Charles handed her a formal document outlining the new protocols. The official language made everything seem cold and bureaucratic, transforming her loved ones into potential security risks rather than the family members who had celebrated her wedding to the king just years earlier. That evening, Camilla made the difficult phone calls to her children and extended family. Tom Parker Bowles took the news with stoic acceptance, having always understood the precarious nature of their position. Laura Lopes was more emotional, feeling that her children were being punished for circumstances beyond their control. The palace staff noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Camilla, usually warm and engaging with the household employees, became withdrawn and formal. Her legendary sense of humor, which had endeared her to many who initially doubted her suitability as queen, seemed to disappear overnight. Charles threw himself into his royal duties with increased intensity, perhaps trying to convince himself that the sacrifice had been worthwhile. State banquets continued. Foreign dignitaries were received with full ceremony, and the business of being king carried on. Yet those closest to the couple could see the strain in their interactions. The media, always vigilant for signs of royal discord, began to notice that Camilla's family members were conspicuously absent from events where they had previously been regular attendees. Speculation began to swirl about potential rifts within the royal household, though the official palace position remained that all decisions were made in the best interests of the monarchy. As autumn approached, the full impact of Charles's decision began to manifest in ways neither he nor his advisors had fully anticipated. The royal marriage, once seen as a source of stability for the king, now carried an undercurrent of sadness that would prove difficult to conceal from the public eye. The weeks following Charles's announcement brought an uncomfortable silence to the royal residences. Camilla found herself walking through rooms that had once echoed with the laughter of her grandchildren, now eerily quiet except for the soft footsteps of palace staff going about their duties. The Queen's apartments, once filled with family photos and personal mementos, began to feel more like a museum than a home. Lady Susan Hussey, one of the few remaining long-serving courtiers, watched with growing concern as the royal couple's relationship deteriorated. Having served the royal family for decades, she had witnessed many crises, but the current situation felt different. This wasn't about public scandals or political pressures that would eventually fade away. This was about family, and family wounds often proved the most difficult to heal. Charles attempted to maintain normalcy by increasing his engagement with official duties. He scheduled additional meetings with government ministers, extended his time reviewing state papers, and even took on extra patronage responsibilities. However, those who worked closely with him noticed that his famous attention to detail had become almost obsessive, as if throwing himself into work could somehow justify the personal cost of his decision. The king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, found himself in the uncomfortable position of managing not just official business but also the emotional fallout within the royal household. Staff members reported that heated conversations could sometimes be heard from the royal apartments, followed by long periods of cold silence. Camilla's daily routine changed dramatically. Where she had once spent mornings planning family visits or coordinating with her children about upcoming events, she now filled her time with solo activities. Her love of reading became almost compulsive, and she was often found in the palace library at unusual hours, surrounded by books that seemed to provide the only escape from her current reality. The Queen's dresser, Maria, noticed that Camilla had stopped wearing several pieces of jewelry that had been gifts from her children. The sapphire earrings that Tom had given her for her birthday remained in their box, and the bracelet from Laura gathered dust in the jewelry case. These small acts of self-denial spoke volumes about the internal struggle she was experiencing. Palace. Sources began to whisper about the change in dynamics during formal events. Previously, Charles and Camilla had been seen as a complementary team, with Camilla's warmth balancing Charles's more formal demeanor. Now they appeared to be going through the motions, fulfilling their duties but lacking the natural chemistry that had once made their partnership so effective. The situation became more complicated when foreign dignitaries began to notice the absence of Camilla's family members at state functions. The Spanish Queen, who had developed a friendship with Laura Lopes during previous visits, inquired about her whereabouts during a formal dinner. The awkward explanation provided by palace officials only served to highlight the unusual nature of the situation. Charles found himself caught between his role as king and his identity as a husband. During private moments, he could see the pain in Camilla's eyes, but his advisors continued to reinforce that his decision had been necessary for the stability of the monarchy. The constitutional crisis that might have emerged if he had ignored their counsel could have been devastating for the institution he had sworn to protect. The Queen's charitable work, which had always been a source of personal satisfaction, became tinged with irony. At events supporting family welfare organizations, Camilla had to speak about the importance of family unity while dealing with the forced separation from her own loved ones. Her speeches, once delivered with genuine passion, now carried an undertone of sadness that perceptive audience members couldn't help but notice. Staff members reported that the royal couple had begun taking their meals separately more frequently. The informal dinners that had been a hallmark of their private life together were replaced by formal arrangements that felt more like state occasions than intimate family time. The head chef mentioned that special requests for family favorites had stopped coming from Camilla's office. The king's attempts to compensate for the situation only seemed to make things worse. When he arranged for a particularly elaborate birthday celebration for Camilla, complete with her favorite flowers and a specially commissioned piece of music, the gesture felt hollow without her family present to share the moment. The absence of her children's voices singing happy birthday created a void that no amount of royal pageantry could fill. Security reports indicated that Camilla had been making more frequent calls to her family members, though the conversations were necessarily brief and carefully monitored. The natural spontaneity that had characterized her relationships with Tom and Laura was being replaced by formal, almost business-like communications that satisfied security protocols, but left everyone involved feeling frustrated. The emotional toll began to manifest in physical ways. Palace physicians noted that both Charles and Camilla were showing signs of stress-related health issues. The king's chronic back problems worsened, while Camilla experienced recurring headaches that seemed immune to treatment. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that their marriage, which had once been a source of strength, was now contributing to their declining health. As winter approached, the palace walls that had witnessed centuries of royal drama now contained a different kind of tragedy. This wasn't about political intrigue or public scandal, but about the fundamental question of whether love could survive when duty demanded such profound personal sacrifice. Christmas at Sandringham had always been Camilla's favorite time of year. The informal atmosphere of the Norfolk estate provided a welcome respite from the formality of other royal residences, and she had particularly enjoyed watching her grandchildren explore the vast grounds and participate in the family's traditional Christmas morning walk. This year, however, the approach of the holiday season filled her with dread rather than anticipation. The guest list for the royal family's Christmas gathering had been finalized without any input from Camilla, a departure from previous years, when she had been actively involved in planning the festivities. Her children's names were notably absent from the list, replaced by more distant royal relatives and carefully vetted guests who posed no security concerns to the monarchy's reputation. Charles noticed his wife's increasing withdrawal, but seemed powerless to address it without undermining his own authority as king. The decision to exclude her family had been presented to him as non-negotiable by his senior advisors, who painted dire pictures of constitutional crisis if he appeared to show favoritism to non-royal family members during such a visible royal tradition. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine review of Christmas arrangements. Camilla sat in the morning room at Clarence's house, mechanically reviewing menu options and seating charts that felt meaningless without her loved ones present. When the private secretary mentioned that additional security measures would be implemented to ensure that no unauthorized family members could access the Sandringham estate, something inside her finally snapped. "Unauthorized family members?" she repeated, her voice rising for the first time in months. "You're talking about my children. My grandchildren. They've become unauthorized?" The words hung in the air as staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The Queen's legendary composure was cracking, and everyone in the room could feel the tension building. Charles, who had been reviewing correspondence in his study, heard the commotion and arrived to find his wife standing by the window, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. The private secretary quickly excused himself, leaving the royal couple alone in a room that suddenly felt too small to contain the weight of their unresolved conflict. "This has gone too far," Camilla said without turning around. "I've been patient. I've been understanding. I've played the role of the dutiful queen while you've systematically erased my family from our lives. But I won't pretend anymore that this is acceptable." Charles approached carefully, recognizing that this moment would determine the future of their marriage. "You know I had no choice," he began, but Camilla cut him off with a gesture that was more dismissive than anything she had ever directed at him before. "There's always a choice, Charles. You chose the crown over our family over me." Her words were quiet but carried the weight of months of suppressed anguish. "I gave up my old life for you. I endured years of criticism and hatred from people Who thought I wasn't good enough for you? I stood by you when your own family questioned our relationship. And now, when I need you to stand by me, you've chosen your advisors over your wife. The king tried to explain the constitutional implications, the pressure from Parliament, the need to maintain public confidence in the monarchy. But each justification only seemed to deepen the chasm between them. Camilla had heard these arguments before, and they no longer held any power to console her wounded heart. Do you know what it's like? She continued, finally turning to face him. To explain to your grandchildren why they can't visit Grandpa Charles anymore. To tell your own children that they're not welcome at their mother's home because they might embarrass the precious monarchy? The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had. Years of careful royal protocol dissolved, as both gave voice to feelings that had been building beneath the surface. Charles spoke about the impossible burden of being king, about decisions that had to be made for the greater good regardless of personal cost. Camilla talked about the isolation she felt, the sense that her identity as queen had somehow erased her identity as a mother and grandmother. Palace staff, trained to be invisible during private moments, found themselves witnesses to the most honest conversation the royal couple had ever had. The formal language that typically characterized even their private interactions was replaced by raw emotion and fundamental questions about love, duty, and sacrifice. The argument reached its climax when Charles suggested that perhaps, in time, some accommodations could be made for her family's return to royal functions. Camilla's response was swift and devastating. You don't understand, do you? It's not about future accommodations. It's about what you've already taken from me. It's about the fact that when you had to choose between your role as my husband and your role as king, there was never really any contest. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the winter wind rattled the ancient windows of Clarence's house, but inside the only sound was the quiet sobbing that Camilla could no longer contain. Charles reached for her, but she stepped back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional gulf that had opened between them. That evening, Camilla made a decision that would shock the royal establishment. She called her private secretary and requested that arrangements be made for her to spend Christmas with her children at Tom's country home in Gloucestershire. The request was unprecedented. Queens didn't simply skip royal Christmas celebrations to spend time with their non-royal families. Charles received the message through official channels, as if his wife were now communicating with him as a subject rather than as a spouse. The formality of the communication drove home the reality of how broken their relationship had become. The king, who had waited decades to marry the woman he loved, was now facing the possibility that duty had cost him the very happiness he had sacrificed so much to achieve. The palace walls that had witnessed their wedding celebration now contained the echoes of their marriage's greatest crisis, and everyone who heard those echoes wondered if love could survive such a profound test of loyalty. The news of Camilla's unprecedented decision to spend Christmas away from the royal family sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. Senior courtiers who had advised Charles to take a firm stance with his wife's family now found themselves dealing with a crisis they hadn't anticipated. The Queen's absence from Sandringham would be impossible to hide from the media, and explanations would be demanded that could expose the internal rifts they had worked so hard to prevent. Sir Clive Alderton found himself in the unenviable position of crafting press statements that would somehow explain the Queen's absence without revealing the true extent of the royal marital problems. The official line about prior family commitments fooled no one in the press corps, who immediately began investigating what could possibly be more important than Christmas with the king. Meanwhile, at Clarence's house, Camilla packed her personal belongings with trembling hands. Each item she placed in her suitcase felt like another step away from the life she had built as queen. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah Troughton, watched with growing concern as Camilla methodically folded clothes, while tears streamed down her face. "Are you certain about this, Your Majesty?" Sarah asked gently. She had served the royal family long enough to understand the gravity of what Camilla was doing. Queens didn't simply leave their husbands, especially when those husbands were kings. Camilla paused in her packing, holding a photograph of her grandchildren that had been taken at the palace the previous Christmas. "I can't pretend anymore, Sarah. I can't smile and wave and act like everything is fine when my heart is breaking every single day. My family needs to know that they still matter to me, even if they don't matter to the crown. The decision to leave had not come easily. Camilla had spent sleepless nights weighing her options, understanding that her choice would have consequences far beyond her personal happiness. As queen, her actions reflected on the monarchy itself, and her absence from Sandringham would inevitably become a public spectacle. Charles learned of his wife's departure plans not through direct conversation, but through a formal memo from her private secretary. The bureaucratic language of the communication, Her Majesty will be unavailable for royal duties from December 22nd through January 2nd due to family obligations, struck him like a physical blow. His wife was now speaking to him through intermediaries, reducing their marriage to official correspondence. The king's immediate reaction was anger. How dare she put him in such an impossible position? Her absence would create exactly the kind of media circus that his decision about her family had been designed to prevent. But beneath the anger was something more devastating, the realization that he was losing the woman he had waited a lifetime to marry. That evening, Charles did something he had never done during his entire reign. He dismissed his security detail and walked alone through the gardens of Clarence House, hoping to clear his head before making what might be the most important decision of his kingship. The December air was sharp and cold, matching the chill that had settled over his marriage. Inside the house, Camilla was making final preparations for her departure when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room. She recognized Charles's distinctive gait and felt her heart race, hoping against hope that he had come to tell her that they could find a way to work through their problems together. Instead, Charles appeared in the doorway looking older than she had ever seen him. The weight of the crown, both literal and figurative, seemed to have aged him years in just a few months. They stood looking at each other across a room that felt like an ocean, both wanting to bridge the gap but uncertain how to take the first step. "Don't go," Charles said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, we can find another way." Camilla's resolve nearly crumbled at the vulnerability in her husband's voice. This wasn't the king speaking to his queen, but a man asking his wife not to leave him. For a moment she almost dropped her suitcase and ran to him, ready to forget everything that had transpired and return to the comfortable fiction that their love could overcome any obstacle. But then she remembered her son's voice on the phone, asking why he couldn't bring his children to see their step-grandfather anymore. She thought about her daughter's tears when she learned that her wedding anniversary celebration couldn't include a traditional royal blessing. She recalled the loneliness of the past months, sitting in rooms that had once been filled with family, laughter. "I can't stay," she replied, her own voice breaking. "Not like this. Not when staying means accepting that my family means nothing to you. I won't be a queen who abandoned her children for a crown." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest moment of their entire relationship. Charles spoke about the impossible pressures of kingship, about advisors who painted apocalyptic scenarios if he appeared to show favoritism to his wife's family. He talked about sleepless nights when he questioned his own decisions but felt trapped by constitutional requirements and political realities. Camilla listened, understanding intellectually why he had made the choices he had, but unable to forgive the emotional cost those choices had imposed on their family. She spoke about feeling erased, about becoming a queen without a past, expected to perform royal duties while denying the very relationships that had shaped her into the person Charles claimed to love. As midnight approached, both realized that this conversation had come too late. The damage to their relationship had progressed beyond the point where words alone could heal it. The irony was devastating. Charles had protected the monarchy by making decisions that might ultimately destroy his marriage, creating exactly the kind of scandal he had been trying to prevent. The next morning, Camilla's departure from Clarence House was captured by photographers who had been tipped off by palace sources. The images of the queen leaving with her personal luggage, tears visible behind her sunglasses, would dominate newspaper front pages and fuel speculation about the stability of the royal marriage. Charles watched from his study window as his wife's car disappeared into London traffic, taking with it his hopes for a marriage that could survive the pressures of being king and queen. The palace that had been their home now felt like a prison, beautiful but empty, containing all the trappings of power but none of the warmth of genuine partnership. Christmas morning at Sandringham felt eerily different without the Queen's presence. The traditional royal walk to church proceeded as scheduled, but observers noted the king's somber demeanor and the conspicuous absence of his wife. Prince William and Catherine tried their best to maintain normal festivities for the sake of their children, but even the youngest members of the family seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed in their carefully ordered world. The media response was immediate and ruthless. Tabloid headlines screamed about palace crisis and royal marriage in tatters, while more serious publications began investigating the circumstances that had led to such an unprecedented situation. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades admitted they had never seen anything quite like a queen simply refusing to attend the royal Christmas celebration. Meanwhile, at Tom Parker Bowles's country home in Gloucestershire, a very different kind of Christmas was unfolding. Camilla sat by the fireplace watching her grandchildren open presents with the kind of unbridled joy that had been absent from her life for months. The simple pleasure of being surrounded by her family, without protocol officers or security briefings, felt like breathing fresh air after being trapped underground. Laura Lopes had initially been hesitant about her mother's dramatic decision, understanding the potential consequences for the monarchy's reputation. However, seeing Camilla smile genuinely for the first time in months convinced her that her mother had made the right choice. The woman who had gracefully accepted the role of queen was reclaiming her identity as a mother and grandmother, even if it meant challenging centuries of royal tradition. Back at Sandringham, Charles found himself going through the motions of Christmas celebration, while his thoughts remained consumed with his absent wife. The traditional Christmas broadcast, which he and Camilla had been scheduled to record together, had to be hastily rewritten to explain her absence without revealing the true depth of their marital problems. The king's private secretary worked overtime to manage the crisis, fielding calls from government ministers who were concerned about the constitutional implications of the Queen's actions. Some suggested that Camilla's behavior bordered on abandonment of royal duty, while others argued that the monarchy's survival depended on appearing more human and relatable to modern audiences. Sir Clive Alderton found himself in the impossible position of trying to maintain palace unity while managing two separate royal households. Camilla's decision to remain with her family had created logistical nightmares, security concerns, and protocol questions that had no historical precedent. How long could a queen remain away from her royal duties? What message did her absence send about the stability of the monarchy? The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had officiated at Charles and Camilla's wedding, quietly reached out to both parties, offering his services as a mediator. The spiritual leader of the Church of England understood that this crisis went beyond personal marital problems. It touched on fundamental questions about duty, family, and the nature of modern monarchy. Public opinion polls showed a fascinating divide. Older generations, who remembered the stability of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, were largely critical of Camilla's decision to prioritize her personal family over royal duties. However, younger demographics showed surprising support for a queen who was willing to stand up for her children and grandchildren, even at great personal cost. Social media exploded with commentary about the situation. Team Camilla began trending, with supporters praising her for refusing to abandon her family for the sake of appearances. Critics countered with "Yes, royal duty first," arguing that accepting the crown meant accepting certain sacrifices that came with the position. The international press watched with fascination as the British monarchy faced a crisis that seemed uniquely modern. Foreign correspondents noted that this wasn't a scandal about infidelity or financial impropriety, but about fundamental questions of family loyalty that resonated across cultural boundaries. Charles attempted to maintain his regular schedule of royal engagements, but his performances lacked their usual energy. Those who worked closely with him noted that he seemed to be operating on autopilot, fulfilling his duties while clearly preoccupied with his personal situation. The king, who had waited decades to marry Camilla, was now facing the possibility that his decision to exclude her family had cost him his marriage. Government ministers began expressing private concerns about the long-term implications of the royal crisis. The monarchy's stability was considered essential to Britain's international reputation and constitutional system. Some suggested that if the king couldn't manage his own household, it raised questions about his ability to lead the nation. Meanwhile, Tom Parker Bowles found himself thrust into an unexpected role as a spokesman for his mother's position. Journalists camped outside his Gloucestershire home, hoping to catch glimpses of the Queen and obtain quotes about her unprecedented decision. Tom handled the attention with dignity, simply stating that his mother was spending time with her family during the holiday season. The absence of Camilla from New Year's Eve celebrations at the palace created another media sensation. The traditional reception for government ministers and diplomatic corps proceeded without the Queen, leading to awkward explanations and renewed speculation about the future of the royal marriage. As January approached, both Charles and Camilla faced a critical decision point. The Queen's extended absence from royal duties couldn't continue indefinitely without creating a constitutional crisis. Yet neither seemed willing to compromise on the fundamental issues that had driven them apart. Palace sources began leaking, stories about potential solutions being discussed behind closed doors. Some suggested that a carefully managed reconciliation could be arranged, with limited accommodation made for Camilla's family members at select royal functions. Others whispered about more dramatic possibilities, including the unprecedented scenario of a queen effectively separating from her king while both remained in their royal roles. The kingdom that had celebrated their wedding with such enthusiasm now watched with bated breath to see whether love could find a way to coexist with duty, or whether the crown would ultimately prove too heavy for their marriage to bear. The first week of January brought an unexpected visitor to Gloucestershire. Princess Anne, known for her practical approach to royal problems, arrived unannounced at Tom Parker Bowles's home, requesting a private conversation with her sister-in-law. The Princess Royal had watched the crisis unfold with growing concern, understanding that her brother's marriage was facing challenges that could destabilize the entire royal institution. Anne found Camilla in the garden, wrapped in a simple coat, watching her grandchildren play on the frozen lawn. The sight of the Queen looking so relaxed and genuinely happy struck Anne immediately. This wasn't the polished, carefully presented royal figure she had grown accustomed to seeing at official functions, but a grandmother enjoying precious time with her family. "You look better than you have in months," Anne observed, settling onto a garden bench beside Camilla. The two women had developed a mutual respect over the years, appreciating each other's no-nonsense approach to royal life. Camilla smiled sadly. "I feel more like myself than I have since the coronation. But I know I can't hide here forever. The press is having a field day, and Charles must be under tremendous pressure." Their conversation lasted for hours, covering everything from constitutional responsibilities to the fundamental question of whether personal happiness could coexist with royal duty. Anne spoke candidly about her own experiences balancing family life with royal obligations, acknowledging that the pressures on a queen were vastly different from those faced by other royal family members. "Charles made a mistake," Anne admitted, bluntly, "but he made it from a place of love for the institution, not from any desire to hurt you. The advisors who pushed him into this corner did everyone a disservice." Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, Charles was having his own moment of reckoning. The king had spent days reviewing the original reports that had prompted his decision to restrict Camilla's family access. Reading them again with fresh eyes, he began to see how his advisors had perhaps overstated the risks and understated the personal costs of their recommended actions. The tipping point came when Charles received a letter from a 10-year-old girl, named Emma, who had written to ask why the Queen looked so sad in recent photographs. The child's innocent question cut through all the political maneuvering and constitutional concerns, forcing Charles to confront the human cost of his decision. That evening, Charles did something that shocked his entire staff. He dismissed his security detail and drove alone to Gloucestershire, arriving at Tom Parker Bowles's home just as the family was finishing dinner. The sight of the king standing on a private doorstep, without fanfare or official announcement, was unprecedented. Tom answered the door himself, immediately recognizing the gravity of the moment. "Your Majesty," he said formally, then added more quietly, "She's in the sitting room." Charles found Camilla reading to her youngest grandchild, a scene so domestic and peaceful that it made his heart ache. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment neither spoke. The child, unaware of the drama surrounding the adults, simply said, "Grandpa Charles," and ran to hug him. The reunion that followed wasn't immediate or easy. Charles and Camilla talked through the night, finally addressing not just the immediate crisis but the underlying tensions that had been building throughout their marriage. For the first time, Charles truly listened as Camilla explained what it felt like to be asked to choose between her roles as queen and as a mother. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to choose," Charles said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I was protecting our marriage by protecting the monarchy. I didn't realize I was destroying it instead." The conversation was interrupted by sunrise and the arrival of Laura Lopes with her children. The sight of Charles sitting at her kitchen table looking exhausted but somehow more human than she had seen him in months moved her to tears. For the first time since the crisis began, the extended family was together in the same room, sharing coffee and conversation without protocol officers or security briefings. The decision to return to royal duties wasn't made that morning, but the foundation for reconciliation was laid. Charles acknowledged that his advisors had given him incomplete counsel, focusing on protecting the institution while ignoring the human elements that made the monarchy relevant to modern Britain. The following days, a new arrangement was quietly negotiated. Camilla's family members would be welcomed back to select royal functions, with security protocols that were thorough but not punitive. More importantly, Charles committed to including Camilla in all future decisions that might affect their extended family. The Queen's return to Windsor was handled with characteristic royal understatement. There were no dramatic announcements or public apologies, just a gradual resumption of normal royal activities. However, those who worked closely with the royal couple noted an immediate change in their dynamic. The formal distance that had characterized their recent interactions was replaced by a warmth that seemed more genuine than ever before. The first public appearance of the reconciled royal couple came at a charity event supporting family welfare organizations. The irony wasn't lost on observers who noted that Camilla spoke about the importance of family support with a passion that had been missing from her recent speeches. Charles, standing beside her, seemed more relaxed and attentive than he had appeared in months. Media coverage of the reconciliation was extensive but respectful. The press recognized that they had witnessed something unprecedented in royal history. A king and queen working through genuine marital problems in the public eye and emerging stronger for the experience. Palace walls that had echoed with tension and barely contained arguments now rang with different sounds. Laughter returned to the royal residences as Camilla's grandchildren were once again welcome visitors, their young voices bringing life to rooms that had felt like museums during the difficult months. The transformation wasn't just superficial. Staff members noticed that both Charles and Camilla seemed more energetic and engaged with their royal duties. The Queen's famous warmth with palace employees returned, and she began taking genuine interest in their personal lives again. The King, no longer carrying the weight of a failing marriage alongside his constitutional responsibilities, approached his duties with renewed vigor. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes were gradually reintroduced to royal functions, but with a new understanding of the delicate balance required. They attended events as Camilla's family members, not as quasi-royal figures, and their presence added a human element to royal gatherings that the public found refreshing rather than threatening. The Camilla crisis had taught everyone involved valuable lessons about the nature of modern monarchy. Charles learned that protecting the institution sometimes meant making it more human and relatable, not more distant and formal. Camilla discovered that being queen didn't require abandoning her identity as a mother and grandmother, but rather finding ways to integrate those roles meaningfully. The advisors who had pushed for the original restrictions found their influence significantly diminished. Charles began seeking counsel from a broader range of sources, including voices that understood the importance of family stability to overall royal effectiveness. The lesson was clear. A monarchy that appeared strong but was built on personal sacrifice and family dysfunction was ultimately weaker than one that acknowledged human complexity. 6 months after the crisis reached its peak, Charles and Camilla celebrated their wedding anniversary with a small family gathering that included all their children and grandchildren. The photographs from that evening, showing a relaxed royal couple surrounded by multiple generations of their blended family, became some of the most popular royal images of the year. The palace walls that had witnessed their greatest crisis now contained a different kind of royal story. This wasn't about maintaining facades or hiding human struggles, but about finding authentic ways to serve the nation while remaining true to the relationships that gave their lives meaning. Public opinion. Polls showed that the royal couple's approval ratings had actually increased following their reconciliation. The British public, dealing with their own family complexities and work-life balance challenges, found the royal couple more relatable and inspiring than they had when they appeared to have perfect lives without personal struggles. The international press took note of how the British monarchy had handled a very modern crisis. Rather than trying to suppress or deny the problems, Charles and Camilla had worked through them with dignity and emerged as examples of how couples could navigate competing loyalties without destroying their relationships. As autumn arrived, bringing with it the anniversary of the crisis that had nearly torn them apart, Charles and Camilla stood together on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during a state visit. Below them, crowds cheered not just for their king and queen, but for a couple who had proven that love could indeed coexist with duty when both partners were willing to fight for what truly mattered. The tears that had once shaken the palace walls had been replaced by something more precious: genuine laughter, honest conversation, and the comfortable sounds of a family that had learned to support each other through the unique challenges of royal life. The monarchy was stronger not because it had avoided human problems, but because it had faced them honestly and found solutions that honored both constitutional requirements and personal relationships. In the end, the greatest lesson wasn't about royal protocol or constitutional law, but about the simple truth that even kings and queens are, at their core, people who need love, family, and the freedom to be authentically themselves while serving something larger than their individual desires.